looking at the situation, it is, as it has been since October the 7th, incredibly precarious and incredibly dangerous. We don't know the details of the negotiations at the moment, but is there anything really that can be done at this point to prevent the Israelis going ahead with some sort of offensive in that southern part of Gaza?
Yeah, where there's more than 1 million people and more than half of them are children. Anything that the Israelis are doing around Rafah is going to result, unless they're really careful, in the deaths of innocent people. And what is the reason for this? If there's a potential peace process happening, then our concern is, not only have we been saying for I don't know how long that they must not go into Rafah, but to go in now, when potentially there might be a peace process. Hamas has agreed to, some pretty major concessions, and they need to sit down and they need to talk. And the rest...
Yeah, crazy. It's crazy how the lunatic state that has been continually engaging in this campaign, despite all of the things that they've done so far, total impunity from Western nations like the US and the UK to allow them to do this. It's weird how when the UK government and indeed the UK opposition won't call them out when they've engaged in war crimes up to now, they feel like they can get away with a humanitarian catastrophe in Rafah because there's been no pushback anywhere else. I wonder who might be to blame for that, Emily.
The rest of the world is putting every effort they can into diplomacy, into putting pressure on Israel. Israel really needs to listen.
Right,
I think Israel does have that right. Does that sound like diplomacy and pressure to you?
Israeli government broadly would say that it was always intending to go into Rafah to clear the area, they would say, of Hamas terrorists who are operating there, whether the peace process or a deal was met. But just what can we do really in this situation to pull back or get the Israelis to pull back from the brink?
Well, I think what we've got to do is to make sure that we are continuing to talk to Israel, to make sure that they are continuing to talk in these the peace talks, and that's my understanding is that is what they are doing, to make sure that they are there at the table.
It's almost like they don't actually want peace. They want to make it look like they do care, and then when reasonable proposals get put on the table that Hamas agreed to, this isn't the first ceasefire agreement that they've agreed to. They've agreed to other ceasefire agreements previously and have put down plenty of conditions where they would happily agree to a ceasefire, yet Israel don't want it. Israel really do not want it. They were always intending to go into Rafah. The Rafah invasion has always essentially been code for endless war forever and it never stops. Even when reasonable demands are made, and they don't care about their own hostages, not only because they won't actually enter into any agreements that would release them, but on top of that, they keep bombing the areas where the hostages are. They've killed plenty of their own hostages already. The idea that somehow they're interested in peace at all is for the birds. It's completely for the birds.
We don't want to see any more bloodshed. We don't want to see any more bombing from our pictures that we're seeing from here. But we've also got to remind Israel of their responsibilities. That yes, Rafah is the last Hamas stronghold, and my understanding is that when they closed off the area yesterday, it was because rockets were coming. There was a few rockets fired in from that particular area, and I suspect what's happening. Hamas will clearly be wanting to put the pressure up now, saying we've signed up to this deal, because otherwise they want to put the pressure back on Israel.
Yeah, sure, and it was striking, the pictures of Gazans themselves celebrating. They want the fighting to stop, and that must put some pressure on Hamas as well in order to bring a deal. 4 Israeli soldiers were killed in strikes by Hamas at the Kerem Shalom.
But the idea that Hamas haven't been negotiating this when they've been the ones saying we want to see a ceasefire and end to the conflict, and they've happily had that down as being a condition for a ceasefire for months now. And again, Israel haven't wanted to end the conflict. They've not wanted an end to the war. Care more about eliminating Hamas. Remember the Hamas that we now know explicitly from the leaked documents that Benjamin Netanyahu made sure were financed with money funneled through Qatar. We already know that he doesn't want the hostages to be free or the war to end. Not about the safety or the security of his own country anymore. It's about bloodlust and revenge.
Crossing, which is a different crossing to the Rafah crossing with Egypt, but into Israel. A reminder that the fighting on both sides goes on. I'm sat across from 2 very, very intelligent people, and unfortunately,
the way you're talking is treating people like mugs. You can talk about condemnation all you want. You can talk about reminding Israel of their international obligations all you want. But until you're talking about suspending arms sales to Israel, until the Americans are talking about suspending military aid to Israel, all of that finger wagging in the world will not stop Netanyahu from doing what he wants to do, which is launching an absolutely terrible, abhorrent ground assault on Rafah. The images which are coming out on social media at the moment have been for months from Rafah of children buried under the rubble, body parts blown to smithereens. This is the result of Israel being emboldened and effectively being given a carte blanche to interpret its, in Emily's words from October 2023, its absolute right to self-defence to mean collectively punishing the Gazan people.
Well, Emily?
True, 100% true. Again, all this talk and all of this bluster about, they need to do things within international law, when first of all, they won't even necessarily call out the obvious things that they've done that have been breaches of international law. They won't call that out, right? They called it out when it was Putin. They won't call it out when it's Netanyahu. The same things happen under the same kind of circumstances, and the level to which there's infinite condemnation and explicit calling out of the existence of those war crimes when it comes to Putin's actions in Ukraine. And none of the same thing happens to Netanyahu. Nothing at all. All they just do is sit there just wagging their thumbs and go, but the international law, remember, without even explicitly calling out what has been a war crime that has been committed. But of course, none of those words mean anything until there is material pressure placed on the Israeli government. It can't just be words. It can't be a war of words. It has to be actions. Actions, of course, speak louder than words. And Ash Sarkar is correct. Make sure you stop arms sales to Israel, diplomatic support for Israel, financing of the war effort to Israel from both the US and the UK. Until those things stop, words will do nothing to stop Netanyahu from achieving what he sees to be his military aims, which is, of course, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine.
Well, I think that 2 days, 3 days after the first incursions into Israel, when so many people had been killed and there were so many hostages that had been taken, and we were in a live situation.
Well, and there are still hostages.
And we believed, but they were, yeah. But it was still, there was still fighting going on the ground in Israel, and there were, as far as I understood, there was going to be an attempt to get the hostages back. At that stage, just cut the lights off and so on was the right thing to do. But as I said at the time, and there has been some selective reporting, it absolutely is not within international law to cut off supplies to a nation. So
you were asked specifically about food and water,
yes,
not just the lights.
Yes,
and you
yes.
said Israel has an absolute right to defend itself.
And as I also said, as the guy from the UN had said before, I'm sorry for people who hadn't seen the programme, but for the person who was from the UN who was on Newsnight before me had said, within a short period in a war, you can cut off in order to... So essentially...
I'm sorry. She's essentially saying, well, actually, I didn't say that you could cut things off, but this UN guy specifically said that I could in certain circumstances say that. So regardless of what I said, I'm in the right. That's it. That's what she's trying to say here. That's the kind of ludicrous kind of knot that she's tied herself in by essentially, again, just giving Israel carte blanche to commit war crimes. She's the shadow attorney general. She's the person who's supposed to know all the legal bits and pieces, and she can't even get the basics about what collective punishment does or doesn't look like. Because it wasn't just trying to mitigate the level to which supplies were going into Palestine that Hamas could potentially use, if you can imagine such a thing. No, it was, we are fighting human animals, everything will be cut off. There are no innocent civilians in Gaza. We've all heard the statements. Come on, Emily. This is nonsense, and you know it is.
They were going to go into Gaza to try and get the hostages back. Then in that very short period, then it would be right to kind of... and we know that's what Israel has been doing on and off in Gaza anyway. But in this period, that was the thing to do. Not to do it so that you starve people, and not to do it so that you cut off their power so that they don't have water. That's... you do it in a short period.
That's exactly what they did. They specifically said they were cutting off water. That was the whole point of the siege. That's literally what Yoav Gallant said. I'm sorry, Emily. Again, you can't just gaslight me into pretending that what was said by the Israelis wasn't said by the state representatives. This is ridiculous.
period when you're defending yourself, because you have an absolute right to defend yourself, and that's the right thing to do. But it always had to be, as we always said, within the confines of international law.
I think that's a bit like saying, I want to burgle this house, but in a lawful way. I think these two things are completely
Absolutely
contradictory.
Not. It's you've got my stuff in your house, and I'm going in to get it.
And the last thing that I would say is,
That's like saying, well, somebody's burgled my property, so I'm going to make sure that their entire family dies in the process of me returning it. That's a nonsense analogy, Emily.
I think it is for the birds, the idea that you could not see what would be happening now. What was coming out from Israel in terms of politicians' mouths, the references to Amalek, saying that there are no uninvolved civilians, even in those very, very early days, it was clear that civilians were being considered fair targets. So then when you've got leading politicians saying that the right to self-defense includes cutting off food, includes cutting off water and power, that either means that you were unable to see what millions of other people could see was going to happen, which would make me question the quality of the politicians we have in this country, or there's an element of being disingenuous, where you didn't think you had the political room to say this at the start, but now you're worried about the images coming out.
Okay, so may I answer?
Literally, exactly. That's exactly right. Ash Sarkar is 100% on the money. None of this is about principle. None of this is about ethics. None of this. It's all about political positioning. At the start of the war, they were thinking, we can't look too anti-Semitic, can't look too Corbyn-y in response to explicit war crimes being told that they would be happening by Israeli government officials. And now it's like, oh, we might be losing the votes of people who think that ethnic cleansing is bad, or I guess that we'll massively change our position and U-turn completely on this issue. Look, we've backed a ceasefire, even though we turned down the SNP's motion that actually included the condemnation for collective punishment that you now say is actually a war crime in retrospect, now that people are calling out for this position. Again, she has literally been caught of a web of her own making here, from statements that she's previously made. Excellent work by Ash so far.
That. So I think within the short period of the first few days when they were trying to get their hostages back, I think that is one thing. And as things move on, we have been completely clear about what it is that we expect. We expect there to be a ceasefire. It is not necessary for Israel to continue in this way. Israel had an absolute right to defend itself, but now there needs to be an immediate ceasefire. And we have made that clear.
Would you suspend arms sales?
You didn't make it very clear until months and months into the conflict. Again, SNP, Greens, Liberal Democrats even, were all calling for a ceasefire way before you. Greens were calling for one in November, likewise with the SNP. You're catching up, mate. Again, 30,000 people have died. That's enough now. You've had your fun with the ethnic cleansing, Israel, but you have to stop now. Enough people have died. Whereas before that, 29,999, that's fair game in terms of civilian casualties. 30,000, though, that's beyond the pale. It's beyond the pale, and now we need an immediate ceasefire.
Okay. So what I would say is this, is that when we look at some of the images, and I can't sit here in this television studio or in London and decide on a case-by-case basis on what, whether there has been a breach of international law here or there or whatever instances, but as a whole, one begins to really be concerned that there may well be some breaches of international law. And if that is right, then what we need to do, and listen, I've been doing this a long time. I did this when we were arming Saudi Arabia in Yemen. And what you do is you look at what arms are being sold. Are they being used, British arms are being sold, are they being used in the conflict? And is there a breach of international law? Now,
I mean, but there was explicit breaches of international law with what Saudi Arabia did in Yemen. It's clear that it was. It doesn't matter if our weapons are being used to do it and are the arms sales being done at that point or whatever, or specifically before that particular war crime was committed. No, if you have reason to believe that you are selling arms to a country that is engaged in war crimes, then you shouldn't be doing it. It's as simple as that. We should never have been arming an absolutely maniac nation like Saudi Arabia in the first place, regardless of their actions in Yemen. But the Yemen stuff makes it even further beyond the pale. You stood up, Emily Thornberry, you stood up as the Shadow Home Secretary,
literally a communist,
in Parliament, calling out Israeli assassinations of Palestinian civilians during the Great March of Return when Jeremy Corbyn was your party leader. And you were right to do so. Look at you now, Emily. Look at you now, Emily. You are very happy to call out war crimes, called out in UN reports, no less, which we now have UN reports of them happening now under Israel's watch, currently during this current conflict. You're happy to do it in the Commons beforehand. But now, it's all about political positioning. Suddenly, all of my morals have completely gone out of the building and disappeared. Shameful. It's shameful. Owen Jones was right to text you to tell you that he thinks he's disgusted with you.
Can see what seems to be on the face of it breaches of international law. The question then is, what arms are we selling, and are they being used? And that's quite a difficult and a technical thing that needs to be done. And that's why we want to see the advice,
right,
so that we can see the stages that have been gone through to see whether or not we are selling arms that are being used in breach of international law.
Robert.
Issue.
But the impact here on domestic politics is also clear, and that was demonstrated in part in the local elections. We can show you pictures of victorious councillors who stood as independents, particularly with an eye on what is going on in Israel and in Gaza, some of whom were former Labour councillors, and Labour lost its overall majority in Oldham Council for the first time in 30 years. Just how damaging is that, Emily?
Look, we don't want to lose people. We don't want to lose support. Obviously, we don't, and we fight for it.
But how are you going to win them back?
I think that
You're not. They're not going to win them back. Then we're not coming back. I'm sorry. Lines were crossed. You can't just try and make us forget what's happened. You'll have to replace the people who are within the party who've said these things and made these political decisions. Nothing that you will say will bring 30,000 Palestinians back to life, Emily. The damage has been done.
Oldham has been slipping away from us for some time, actually, and that is, that's a worry. I think that in Rochdale, we've had George Galloway going around saying he's going to wipe Labour out of Rochdale.
And he's the Workers' Party of Britain
And
MP
he is the
in
person
Rochdale.
who spins the most extraordinary things against Labour. And we need to counter it, and we need to be clear about what our position is, and we need to be in dialogue with people and explain what it is that we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it.
Robert?
So if you look at the actual electoral demographics, I don't think this is going to cost Keir Starmer his majority. There are obviously
cost
people.
him seats?
There are obviously people who feel very strongly about this, but bluntly speaking, heavily Muslim areas also tend to be incredibly Labour voting. So you have to, even if you lop off quite a lot out of the Muslim vote, it doesn't cost Labour that many seats. But what I think this is an interesting sign of is the way that assuming Labour form the next government, as I think everyone is assuming at this point, the pressure on it will come from the left. It will be in just the way that when the Tories are in power, the pressure comes from the right. It's always the base that drives part of the conversation.
Do you agree with that, Ash? I mean, the figures in areas where the Muslim population is larger than 20%, the Labour share was 21% less. I know it's stats here, but less compared to the 2021 local elections. So it's gone down. It's gone down quite considerably. But is Robert right that in the end, at a general election, it won't matter much?
I think it'll vary a lot on a seat-by-seat basis. I think that people are right to identify that there were particular local issues in Rochdale and Oldham as well. But I think the broad picture that Muslims feel intensely betrayed and disappointed by Labour over the issue of Gaza is certainly the case. There's a reason why those leaflets printed with Keir Starmer's own words from that LBC interview. He said, I do think Israel has that right in reference to cutting off food.
Even though Emily and Keir Starmer have clarified, as they would put it, what that meant, and they now have a statement that calls for an immediate ceasefire and the immediate release of all hostages and unimpeded aid into Gaza. You don't think that cut through?
I don't think that it is cutting through. And the reason why is because people interpret that as trying to cover your own back after the horrors of what's going on in Gaza have been made clear to the world.
That's not true. And so
that's what people think of as true.
Yeah, and that's why it's important for us to engage and for us to talk to people and explain, that in the initial stages of a war, when, as has been said so well, Israel was under attack in the way that it was. So many people were killed. There were so many horrors, and Israel had the right to defend itself and try and get its hostages.
So why
back.
could those angry people see something you couldn't?
There's a broader question here, because the Conservative share was 11% less, and independent candidates increased their share by 25%. As well. But the broader question is the amount that the issue is being discussed and is perhaps at the front of some people's minds in terms of local elections and whether that stays. Is it healthy to have increasing amounts of politics based on religious or ethnic lines?
Well, I think that reducing it to a religious issue is wrong. There are also lots of young people who aren't Muslim who feel profoundly morally outraged by what's going on, and it's their democratic
and
right
middle-aged people and old people too.
Yes.
To vote on that
watching
basis.
the television
Muslim
just
voters
says,
think you were let
just
down.
says make it stop. This is terrible. Look what's going on. We must make it stop. We must be able to do something.
And the thing is, the issue, of course, the frustrating thing as well here is that Emily Thornberry and people like her who try to frame the pro-Palestinian side of this issue, or at the very least the pro-ceasefire side of this issue, is entirely being about people seeing unimaginable horrors and just wanting it to stop regardless. I'm like, we all do want it to stop, that's true. But what this is specifically trying to do is it's trying to essentially take all of the legitimate and educated criticisms of the political situation, including things like the failure of the peace process, the history of Israel-Palestine relations, the current actions and ideology of the Netanyahu administration and Israeli politics more broadly, and the way in which that we've reached this situation politically. That's all getting sidelined. And essentially, it allows Emily Thornberry to dismiss all of those criticisms under the guise of the fact that, well, there are just people out there who want the war to stop because they think that it's bad. But it has to continue because Israel has the right to defend itself, and, it's unfortunate. No, we have political criticisms here. The criticisms of the pro-Palestine side that we have of the Israeli government and the Israeli state are central to the reasons why we oppose the conflict and why we want it to stop, why we've been wanting a ceasefire for 6 months at this point. Not just war is terrible, make it stop. It's the Israeli government is perpetrating ethnic cleansing because that's the explicit ideology of the Likud party who's in power, bolstered by even further right parties who are more Kahanist than Netanyahu is. And the result of the reason why we've got to this conflict is because of the failure in the peace process and the material relationship between Israel and the Palestinian people and the material response to 60 years of occupation. That's it. That's what we're talking about here. It's the whole history is important, and you can't just hand wave that away by saying, well, people just don't like war. It's a real infantilization of the pro-Palestine side, essentially used to try and curry favour with the pro-Israel side, who are essentially trying to dismiss all of the historical criticisms by saying, it's just war. These kind of thing happens in war. I know you don't like it, but war has to happen. I'm like, the issue is we don't think it does have to happen. Again, because our criticisms have historical context.
Robert, do you think Labour are making, Ash, a big enough, a bold enough offer to the electorate when it comes to the economy?
They are making enough of an offer to win the next general election. Basically, you just need a dog with a red rosette and you'd probably win because people hate the Tories. Are they doing enough to address the deep systemic issues of this country? The answer is no. I mean, if you go around and you talk to people, not who are you going to vote for? What's going on in your life? Do you feel hopeful about the direction of society? The answer to that is largely, no, I don't feel hopeful about the direction of society. And I think if you ask people, do you feel positive about the message Labour is putting out? The answer is also no. You don't make pledges without backing down on them. You treat many of your core voters with disdain, with negative briefings against Muslim voters and young voters whenever you think things aren't going your way. And you've mistaken.
True, just to clarify that, they described losing Muslim voters as quote-unquote shaking off the fleas and tried to claim that the Middle East was responsible for them potentially losing the West Midlands mayoralty. And they describe essentially all young people as being Trotskyist, anti-Semite, entryist, militant tendency, pinko commie, student activist protesters, rather than people with a legitimate political viewpoint.
I think people's loathing of the Conservative Party as love for Labour, that will be enough to get you over the line in, for a first term in office. Will it keep you there? I'd say no.
I don't think I've ever briefed again.
And it won't. First of all, because they're not going to solve all the problems that people need them to solve, to improve people's material conditions, to keep them in power. But on top of that, their base will move elsewhere. If they get ignored in the run-up to the election, and then also get ignored when it comes to how they set policy when they're in office, yeah, they'll abandon them and they'll move to somebody who actually promises change. From 2015 to 2019, people who didn't like the politics of the Labour right warmed to Corbyn specifically and joined the party to support him. Now that's not an option, they'll just leave. You said it as much, or at least Keir Starmer did. The door is open and you can leave. Yeah, we've all left, mate. Rachel Reeves on the BBC Breakfast sofa, when asked by Charlie State about all of those people who say that you should be wanting to tax the rich by having wealth taxes or increases in capital gains tax, she explicitly said, well, if people want to express that opinion, they can do so at the ballot box. Yeah, Rachel, I will. I'll be voting for the Green Party because they promise both of those things and you don't. It's as simple as that. They're telling us not to vote for them, so of course I fucking won't. Simple as that.
Against young people.
Not you, but senior Labour sources do.
But then, Emily, can I...
People in the shadows, I don't know, we know, I mean...
Well, let me point you to this, because this is an important part of what Labour is offering, or says it's going to offer. In The Guardian, scaling back Labour's workers' rights plan, this is a plan largely from Angela Rayner, the Deputy Leader, would be disastrous, warns the TUC president. Is that what's going to happen? You are going to scale back before the election?
No, it's not.
Right.
No, we're really proud of it. Absolutely. We're really proud of it. It's a central part.
You've already scaled it back. You've already said that's going to be subject to business consultation. You've already scaled back fair pay agreements to be only in the social care sector. And you already scaled back at the National Policy Forum the way in which that you were going to change the casualisation of our workforce by having a single category of worker. It's already been walked back and walked down up to this point. Also, I'm sure all of the Labour rights will tell me, no, they won't drop it. They won't drop it at all. You're just lying. You're just lying, Helena. They're not going to drop it at all. And then 6 months later, when they say, no, we categorically definitely are watering it down and dropping it, they'll be like, how very incredibly based. Well done. This is exactly what Labour needs to look sensible to win the election. And the cycle will continue anew.
Part of our manifesto, and we think that it is part of the way in which we're going to transform this economy.
Right. I mean, you've got it set out here. In fact, when I find it, there are here. Labour will bring in the right to switch off and work autonomously. You're still going to do that? Labour will update trade union legislation, so it's whatever that means, fit for a modern economy. Labour will strengthen the law to enforce workplace rights.
So that you can vote in trade union votes online. I mean, you can do it for Tory leadership, but the Tories won't let trade unionists vote online. You all have to turn up at the meeting and so on. And then you have to get a certain proportion of trade unionists to actually vote one way or the other, when actually, if they were working from home, they'd much rather vote online.
All right, and Labour will strengthen rights and protections for workers and the self-employed. You'll ban 0 hours contracts and end fire and rehire. And you'll make flexible working a day one right. That is all going to happen. Doesn't sound...
Yeah, no, it is. No,
emphatic.
I mean, sorry, I thought I was so emphatic about it before.
Yes,
I didn't think I needed to do it again.
Oh, no, well, these are different...
You know what? There's a first time for everything, and if Keir Starmer sticks to this promise, I'll be very happy indeed. There's just one last thing I want to say. There are other countries with much stronger workplace protections, with better sick pay, better maternity pay, more protections for early workers. Well, I'd say in Scandinavian countries, you have businesses there, and more importantly, you have a quality of life there where people say we would like to emulate that.
So they have an entirely different approach, because we actually have a tribunal system. You'll have to entirely unwork and undo the tribunal system.
And how strong is our tribunal system?
So you're almost getting... So what we're doing, we are tackling things after the issue, so people can take people to tribunal. Yeah, well, you're almost having to ask permission before you can take people on in some other countries.
Well, let's bring everyone back to today. And
we can't have proper workplace protections and broad union representation and a fair standard between the wages of the rich and the wages of the poor, the difference between the owners and the workers. We can't mediate that because of the tribunals, chat. Why won't somebody please think of the tribunals? You'd have to change another piece of legislation to be able to have working people dignity, and because we can't be bothered to do that, I guess you'll have to deal with perpetual indignity forever. Fucking hell, hate these people. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership. It's just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.